June 24, 1942. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Minoru Genda, arguably the finest tactical aviator in the Japanese Navy, stood before a room of senior officers examining intelligence photographs and combat reports from American naval operations in the Coral Sea and at Midway. The photographs showed an American fighter aircraft designated the F-4F Wildcat. The intelligence files provided specifications: single engine, radial engine, 6.50 caliber machine guns, operational ceiling of 31,000 feet, maximum speed 330 miles per hour. By American standards, the specifications seemed unremarkable. By Japanese standards, the aircraft was an engineering failure. "Look at the fuselage," Genda said, pointing at the photographs. "Thick, heavy, clumsy. Compare this to our Zero. The Zero climbs 500 feet per minute faster. It turns at least 20 degrees tighter. It has greater range by 500 miles. Speed is nearly equal, but the Zero is more maneuverable. By every metric that defines fighter aircraft performance, the American design is inferior." The assessment was not unique. Japanese aviation doctrine had been built on the assumption that their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, represented the pinnacle of fighter design. Light, maneuverable, capable of sustained turning that no American fighter could match, the Zero had achieved air superiority across the Pacific with such regularity that Japanese pilots had begun treating American aircraft as inevitable victims rather than genuine threats. What Genda and the Japanese High Command did not know was that they were evaluating the Wildcat by the wrong criteria. They were measuring it against the Zero's strengths: turning radius, climb rate, range. They were not measuring it against qualities that would prove far more significant: structural integrity, resilience, the ability to absorb catastrophic damage, and continue flying. The Wildcat was not designed to outturn the Zero, it was designed to outlast it. By the time this distinction became apparent, the war had already turned in ways that made the difference between superior maneuverability and superior durability the difference between victory and defeat. Japanese pilots who had mocked the American fighter as slow and unmaneuverable would discover that unmaneuverable aircraft that would not die were more dangerous than anything they had faced. The Grumman Iron Works, as American workers called the Bethpage, Long Island factory, had deliberately chosen durability over elegance. While the Zero was built to specifications that minimized weight, the Wildcat was built to specifications that maximized survivability. Armor plating protected vital engine components. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires from cannon fire. The airframe was over-engineered to withstand damage that would have torn apart lighter aircraft. The mathematics were straightforward to Japanese pilots accustomed to measuring aircraft by maneuverability. The Zero outperformed the Wildcat in nearly every category that traditional fighter doctrine valued. The Zero climbed faster, turned tighter, had superior range, could reach higher altitude. By the logic of air combat, as Japanese pilots understood it, the Wildcat should not have survived against the Zero. Instead, the Wildcat began surviving. The first serious encounters came in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. Marine pilots flying Wildcats from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal began reporting something that contradicted Japanese intelligence assessments. The American fighters were losing turning engagements, losing climb races, losing speed comparisons, but they were not losing pilots at the rate that doctrine predicted. Japanese pilots would achieve perfect firing position, rake the Wildcat's fuselage with cannon fire and machine gun rounds. The American aircraft would take hits that should have been fatal. Instead of falling in flames, the Wildcat would shudder, lose altitude momentarily, then somehow remain aloft. The pilot would roll inverted and dive away, escaping to altitude where the Zero couldn't climb effectively. Commander Saburo Sakai, among Japan's greatest aces with 64 confirmed victories, encountered this phenomenon personally on August 26, 1942. Sakai had positioned himself behind an American Wildcat at 1,000 feet altitude, pursuing an isolated fighter that should have been an easy kill. At 200 yards, Sakai opened fire with his two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns. Rounds stitched across the Wildcat's wings and fuselage. Sakai was absolutely certain of a kill. The Wildcat, instead of exploding or diving, trailing smoke to certain destruction, turned toward the sun. Sakai followed, but the Zero's engine couldn't maintain climb rate. The American fighter disappeared above. Sakai dove away, frustrated. He was certain he had hit the aircraft. Multiple cannon rounds. The plane should have been destroyed. Later that day, Sakai learned that the Wildcat he had attacked remained operational, returning to base with approximately 100 bullet and cannon holes in its airframe. The pilot, though wounded by fragmentation, landed safely and eventually resumed flying. "How is this possible?" Sakai wrote in his combat diary. "I fired cannon rounds at close range. The aircraft was damaged, yet it continued flying. This violates the physics of air combat. A fighter cannot survive what I delivered, but the Wildcat could, and it did, repeatedly." By September 1942, Japanese intelligence began documenting a pattern that their pilots were reporting with growing frustration. American Wildcats were absorbing damage that fighter aircraft were not supposed to survive. Zero pilots achieved firing positions, the fundamental requirement for aerial victory, yet failed to achieve kills with regularity that violated Japanese tactical assumptions. Hikohosocho Katsuro Ida, commanding a Zero fighter squadron from Rabaul, reported to Fleet Headquarters in October 1942. "The American F-4F aircraft possess defensive qualities we had not anticipated. Their structure withstands cannon fire better than our aircraft structure. Their engines continue functioning despite damage that would stop our power plants. Their pilots employ tactics of escape, diving away, gaining altitude where our aircraft cannot climb, rather than engaging in turning combat where our aircraft is superior. This combination creates casualties we did not predict." The Japanese Navy's response was to conduct a detailed analysis of the Wildcat. They procured wrecked aircraft, sent engineering teams to examine structural components, studied captured pilots and maintenance personnel. The assessment, delivered to the Naval Air Force Headquarters, was simultaneously accurate and useless. The report confirmed that the Wildcat was over-engineered, that armor plating added unnecessary weight, that its structure was deliberately built to redundant specifications. The Mitsubishi engineering team concluded that the Americans had made a fundamental error in aircraft design. The Wildcat was carrying design parameters that modern air combat did not require. The Japanese did not understand that the Americans had deliberately designed against what Japanese pilots considered air combat requirements. While Japanese doctrine valued maximum performance in turning, climbing, and speed, the traditional measures of air superiority, American doctrine had evolved to value something different: the ability to absorb damage and continue fighting. This philosophical difference would manifest in actual combat with increasing clarity as the war progressed. By 1943, Marine and Navy pilots had begun to understand the Wildcat's strengths and had developed tactics that exploited them. Wildcats would not engage in extended turning fights. Instead, they would initiate attacks from altitude using their superior diving speed. They would rake the Zero with machine gun fire and climb back to altitude. If a Zero followed, it would lose energy climbing. If it didn't, the Wildcat would regroup and attack again from advantage. This was not conventional aerial combat as Japanese pilots understood it. Japanese doctrine emphasized continuous maneuvering, sustained turning fights where the most maneuverable pilot won. The Wildcat pilots were employing what became known as boom and zoom tactics, energy fights rather than turning fights. They were fundamentally changing the rules of engagement. More fundamentally, Wildcat pilots began to understand that their aircraft could take damage. This psychological permission changed everything. A Zero pilot, knowing his aircraft could be destroyed by a single well-placed burst, flew defensively, seeking to maintain advantage, never allowing an opponent firing position. A Wildcat pilot, knowing his aircraft had armor, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems, could absorb hits and continue flying. This allowed different tactical approaches, aggressive attacks, willingness to absorb return fire. Japanese pilots began reporting psychological effects they had not anticipated. The Wildcat's apparent immunity to damage created a demoralization effect. They would achieve perfect firing positions, and the American aircraft would not die. Multiple times, round after round, the aircraft that should have exploded continued flying. By mid-1943, the Wildcat had transitioned from its initial frontline fighter role to ground attack and escort functions as newer American fighters, the P-51 Mustang and the P-38 Lightning, arrived in the Pacific Theater. But the lessons the Wildcat taught, lessons about durability, structural integrity, the value of armor plating, had been absorbed into American tactical thinking. When Japan launched the attempt to recapture Henderson Field in October 1942, Japanese intelligence assessed that American aircraft losses would break American will to defend the airfield. Instead, damaged Wildcats were repaired by maintenance crews and returned to flight. Destroyed aircraft were replaced by arriving shipments from American production. German intelligence reports from Tokyo described American replacement capacity as incomprehensible. The Grumman Iron Works produced 7,885 Wildcats during the war. Each aircraft was over-engineered, over-armed, overprotected by the standards of the time. American aircraft designers deliberately chose to sacrifice performance margins that Japanese designers wouldn't have sacrificed. This choice, to build aircraft that could absorb damage rather than aircraft that could avoid damage through superior maneuverability, represented a fundamental philosophical difference between American and Japanese aircraft design. Japanese pilots, evaluating the Wildcat, concluded the Americans had made a design error. They had built an aircraft that was too heavy, too slow, insufficiently maneuverable. American pilots, flying the Wildcat, understood they had been given an aircraft that would bring them home even when damaged. By 1944, the Wildcat had been largely replaced in frontline operations by superior American fighters, but its impact on American aviation philosophy persisted. The principle that durability and armor could be as important as performance became doctrine. The F-6F Hellcat, which began arriving in the Pacific in 1943, incorporated the Wildcat's design philosophy, but improved upon it. The Hellcat was faster, could climb better, yet maintained the Wildcat's armor protection and structural integrity. Japanese pilots encountered the Hellcat and experienced the same frustration they had known with the Wildcat, compounded. The Hellcat had the performance advantages they expected American fighters to lack, combined with the durability that had made the Wildcat so frustrating to kill. Commander Saburo Sakai, reflecting on his combat experience after the war, provided the most eloquent assessment of what had changed. "We built aircraft to turn and climb. We built aircraft for dogfighting. The Americans built aircraft to live. The Zero was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of engineering in its way, but beauty does not survive bullets. The Wildcat was ugly by our standards, overweight, underpowered by our measurements, but it took damage that should have killed it and kept flying. When we fired at the Wildcat, our shots often hit. When we fired at the Hellcat, our shots hit even more often because it was larger. But both aircraft kept flying. It was as if we were trying to kill an enemy that refused to die." Japanese intelligence reports captured in 1945 documented the evolution of their understanding. Early assessments. American fighter design appears inferior to Zero in all performance metrics. By mid-war, American fighters demonstrate unusual structural strength and defensive equipment. Damage tolerance exceeds our aircraft. Final assessment. American aircraft philosophy prioritizes pilot survival and damage absorption over aeronautical performance. This approach has proven devastatingly effective in extended air campaigns. The tactical implications became apparent only as the war progressed, and Japan's pilot production could not match American replacement rates. A Zero pilot shot down had years of training lost. A Wildcat pilot, who crash-landed with damage and survived, could be patched up and returned to combat in days. A Zero that was damaged often burned or dove uncontrollably. A Wildcat that was damaged often flew back to base. The attrition calculus that Japanese military planning had not anticipated began to function. The Americans could lose more aircraft in absolute numbers because they could replace them. The Japanese could sustain fewer losses because they couldn't replace pilots. And the Wildcat's armor and structure meant Japanese victories often resulted in damaged American aircraft rather than destroyed ones. By 1945, the psychological impact on Japanese pilots was complete. They had been trained to believe in Zero superiority. They had been told American aircraft were inferior. They had experienced the opposite repeatedly. Aircraft that should have fallen in flames continued flying. Pilots they should have killed returned to base with their damaged aircraft. In October 1945, at an interrogation center on Guam, a captured Zero pilot who had flown combat operations throughout the war was asked what American aircraft he feared most. His answer surprised the American interrogator. Not the P-51, not the Hellcat, the Wildcat. Because the Wildcat taught us something the Zero could not accept. That durability could defeat maneuverability. That armor could defeat agility. That an aircraft designed to survive could outlast an aircraft designed to excel. We never learned to fight the Wildcat effectively because we could never accept that it was operating by different rules. The Grumman Iron Works had manufactured approximately 7,885 Wildcats during the war. Of these, Japanese aviation destroyed or damaged thousands, yet the attrition rate was never as high as Japanese pilots expected. Damaged Wildcats came back. Destroyed Wildcats were replaced. The statistical inevitability that Japanese doctrine predicted, that continuous aerial combat would eventually eliminate American air power, never materialized. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy was transitioning to newer fighters like the Ki-84 and N-1K, attempting to match American performance advantages while maintaining firepower. But the design philosophy had shifted. Even Japan's newest fighters incorporated more armor than the Zero had carried, more structural redundancy, more defensive equipment. The Wildcat had taught Japanese designers what their pilots should have understood, that an aircraft that could survive fighting was more valuable than an aircraft that was perfect in isolation. The historical assessment is clear. The Wildcat was never the best fighter aircraft of World War II. By most performance metrics, it was surpassed by numerous other aircraft, Japanese and American alike. The Zero was faster at certain altitudes. The Spitfire was more maneuverable. The P-51 Mustang was superior in almost every performance category. But the Wildcat accomplished something more significant than any performance specification. It changed the fundamental calculus of air combat. It proved that durability could be as decisive as performance. That armor could matter more than agility. That an aircraft designed to keep flying was more valuable than an aircraft designed to excel. Japanese pilots who had mocked the Wildcat as slow and clumsy were forced to reckon with a reality their training had not prepared them for. Aerial combat was not primarily about superior turning or climbing. It was about which pilot could absorb damage and continue fighting, which aircraft could take hits and keep flying, which side could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The Wildcat did not dominate the Pacific Air War through superior performance. It dominated through the simple, unglamorous principle of durability. It flew when it should have crashed. It carried damage that should have been fatal. It survived encounters that Japanese doctrine deemed unsurvivable. By war's end, when Japanese pilots reflected on their defeats, many cited not the glamorous victories of the P-51 or the Hellcat, but the frustrating, unkillable Wildcat, the aircraft that refused to die, the fighter that had taught them that the future of air combat belonged not to the most maneuverable pilot, but to the pilot flying an aircraft that could take punishment and continue fighting. The Grumman Iron Works had built an aircraft that was not the best, but it was the most honest. It acknowledged that modern war would destroy aircraft and pilots. It acknowledged that survival mattered more than perfection. It acknowledged that in a war of attrition, the aircraft that could come home damaged was more valuable than the aircraft that was perfect but couldn't survive the journey. Japanese pilots had laughed at the Wildcat as a toy, a clumsy American mistake. But by the end of the war, they were not laughing. They were flying aircraft that had incorporated the Wildcat's lessons about durability. They were experiencing attrition rates that their doctrine had never anticipated. They were discovering that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that performs best in ideal conditions, but the one that survives when everything goes wrong. The Wildcat proved that warfare is not a test of engineering perfection. It is a test of endurance, and the aircraft that could take damage and continue fighting would always outlast the aircraft designed to never be damaged in the first place. That was Grumman's Iron Works, not the most beautiful, not the most performant, but the most resilient. And in the brutal accounting of modern air warfare, resilience proved more decisive than any other single factor.